All right, today we're going to wrap up the Protestant Reformation. We're going to talk about the wars of religion. So we're going to look at some of the wars that the Protestant Reformation spawned, and then we'll move on to other topics. Okay, so the Protestant Reformation split Europe into two religious camps, Catholic and Protestant. And this would lead to a series of religious and civil wars. So we already talked about the Peasants' Revolt in Germany and the Schmalkaldic Wars in Germany. There's French civil wars and wars of religion in the 1550s all the way until the 1590s. There's conflicts in England and Scotland. There's continental wars fought by Philip II of Spain against the Netherlands. And then there's the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War is the big war I want you to remember today. This is kind of the last wars of religion, the last war of religion fought in Europe. All right, so like I said, we kind of mentioned the Peasants' Revolt. The German peasants rose up against their noble rulers. Luther opposed the peasants once they turned violent. At first, he kind of supported them. Maybe 75 to 100,000 peasants are killed. The Schmalkaldic Wars, the Holy Roman Empire, and Charles V tried to defeat Protestantism, but they were unsuccessful. This led to the Peace of Augsburg, and Protestantism gets tolerated. Now, Charles V, he kind of has a strange end to his life. He actually abdicates his throne in 1556, and he retires to a monastery. He divided up his holdings between his son and his brother. So he basically splits his empire in two. There's wars where Sweden, Denmark, and Switzerland adopt Protestantism. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the French Wars of Religion. The kings of France worked to keep France Catholic during the Protestant Reformation. There's basically three families or three factions in France. There's the Bourbon family, they're Protestant. There's the Guise family, they're Catholic. And then there's the Valois family, and they're kind of in the middle. They kind of lean different ways depending on how things are going. If you look at slide 5, you can kind of see who the kings are from the 1550s until the 1590s. That's kind of when the French are fighting their civil wars. Henry II was a very strong king, but then his three sons after him, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, they were very weak. So France was basically ruled by their mother, Catherine de' Medici. She was the real power in France. And then finally at the end, we'll get Henry IV, and he's going to be a strong king. He's actually Protestant, but he converts to Catholicism, and we'll kind of talk about that. Now, like I said, the kings of France had wanted France to stay Catholic. Now, early on, they kind of tolerated Protestantism. But the Protestants were kind of getting too radical, so that's when they started to persecute them. There's an incident in 1534 called the Attack of the Placards. Basically, this one day in 1534, everyone in Paris woke up and went to mass, went to church, and they found these things, these pamphlets nailed to their churches attacking Catholicism. So that angered Catholics because they know Protestants are doing this. So the Catholic kings start to crack down. A lot of French Protestants flee to Switzerland. The French Protestants become known as the Huguenots. So if you say the word Huguenot, you mean a French Protestant. Now, a lot of them went to Switzerland and kind of learn under Calvin. They come back later on and try to spread Protestantism to France. There's a huge incident in the 1570s that basically reignites these civil wars. It's called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Basically, there was a wedding that was going to take place in Paris. It was going to be the Catholic Margaret. She was the sister of the king. She was going to marry the Protestant Henry III of Navarre. He's the guy that becomes Henry IV later on. But the mother, the Queen Mother, she didn't want this. So Catherine de' Medici, she orchestrated a massacre of some of the Protestant wedding guests while they were asleep. 3,000 people, mostly Protestants, were murdered in Paris, and then another 10,000 were killed in the countryside. So 13,000 Protestants killed in France. This poisoned the well for decades to come between Protestants and Catholics. It leads to decades of atrocities on both sides. And basically, from the 1550s to the 1590s, France is so torn up over their own internal struggles that they don't play much of a role in Europe. Eventually, Henry IV, he had been Henry III of Navarre, he becomes the King of France after the previous Henry III of France is assassinated. It's really hard to keep all these guys straight. In England, there's so many Marys, and in France, there's a lot of Henrys. But so Henry IV of Navarre, who becomes Henry IV of France, he becomes king. Now he's a Protestant, but he basically is a realist, and he decides the best thing he could do to heal the religious divide is to become Catholic. So when he becomes king of France, he converts to Catholicism, and he famously said Paris is worth a mass. So basically, if I can become king, I'll give up my version of Christianity and become the other side. Now, when he became Catholic, he did stick up for Protestants. He issued something called the Edict of Nantes. This is basically toleration for Protestants. So if you're a Protestant, you're going to have toleration in France. Now, to kind of get into stuff going on in some of the other countries, just keep in mind that Elizabeth I, when she's Queen of England, she supports Protestants in the wars on the continent. So I'm going to talk about Spain and what they do, but Elizabeth I is kind of fighting against the Spanish as what I'm talking about is going on. But Philip II, he's the son of Charles V. He's the one that takes over the Spanish Empire when Charles V abdicates. He makes it his life's mission as the King of Spain to basically use his empire's wealth and military might to fight Protestantism. So he wants to defend Catholicism and reestablish it as the dominant religion in Europe. If you look at slide 12, you can kind of see that's Philip II's lands, his Spanish lands. Now, there's a revolt in the Netherlands in the 1560s. What ends up happening is Dutch Calvinists, Protestants who follow John Calvin's point of view, they start attacking the Catholic Church in the Netherlands. They destroy statues, they break stained glass window, they think these are graven images like idols. Well, Philip, who's Catholic, doesn't like this, so he sends in the Inquisition and he sends in the Spanish army under the Duke of Alba. And basically, the Spanish army commits atrocities in the Netherlands. In 1567, they execute over 1,000 Dutch Calvinists because they took part in this breaking of stained glass windows and graven images, kind of this revolt. If you look at slide 14, you can see a famous painting of the Dutch Calvinists destroying Catholic statues, and there's a picture of the Duke of Alba. After the Spanish army murders the Dutch Calvinists, this guy, William of Orange, gets involved. He's kind of a noble in the Netherlands. He revolts against the Spanish. He's fighting for the Dutch. The Spanish get their army commits atrocities. The port of Antwerp is sacked by the Spanish army in 1574. This is known as the Spanish Fury. About 7,000 Dutch civilians are slaughtered by the Spanish. So you can see kind of a picture on slide 16. Eventually, William is assassinated in 1584. The Dutch are hanging on by a thread without his leadership. Eventually, another Spanish army led by Alexander Farnese, he's the Duke of Parma. They come and invade the Netherlands. They're capturing city after city. The Dutch have no choice but to ask Elizabeth I, Queen of England, for help. Now, she had been sending them secret aid for years, but now she sends them overt aid. She sends around 6,000 troops, and she had been authorizing English pirates to capture French ships. So the English have secretly been fighting the Spanish for years, but now they're kind of doing it out in the open. Well, once the English get involved openly, that's when Philip II decides to teach the English a lesson. He sends the Spanish Armada to England. So in July of 1588, he sent 130 ships with 20,000 soldiers on board to go invade England, but they failed. The British ships were quicker, they could shoot their cannons farther. They had about 50 ships compared to the Spanish 130. The British also used fire ships, which is basically you light a smaller ship on fire and just float it towards your enemy, and then it crashes into your enemy's wooden ship and lights it on fire. Eventually, the Spanish Armada is battered by storms on the way home. They actually sailed all the way around the British Isles to get back home, and the weather treated them very terribly. Only half of them made it back. The Protestants called this storm a Protestant wind because they said God sent this wind to defeat the Spanish Armada. If you look at slide 19, there's a YouTube link. There's a pretty cool documentary that talks about the military tactics. If you'd like to learn about that, you can kind of watch that on your own. You don't have to. So the war continues on for about another 20 years. France becomes involved once Henry IV comes to the throne. You know, once Henry IV came to the throne in France and accepts Catholicism, France kind of stabilizes, so then they can start exerting their influence more. So basically, you get Philip in Spain versus England and France. Henry defeats those opposed to him by the late 1590s. And in 1604, 1605, you have the Treaty of London. Basically, the Spanish monarchy had declared bankruptcy. Philip II and Elizabeth are dead by 1604. So the war ends between Spain and England. And then in 1609, you have the Treaty of Antwerp. Basically, Spain and the Dutch establish a truce. It'll be another 40 years or so before the Dutch get their independence, but they basically get their independence now. The Netherlands is going to be Protestant. Okay, now the big war is the 30 Years' War. This is probably the biggest war in Central Europe before World War I as far as its devastation. Now, if you remember, the Peace of Augsburg basically said, whatever the prince's religion, that's what the religion of his province has to be. Now, that keeps the peace for a time, but as time moves on, that breaks down. In 1608, the Protestants formed the Protestant League in the Holy Roman Empire. That's where this war is going to be fought mostly. Later on, the Catholics formed the Catholic League. So basically, you have Protestants and Catholics kind of getting ready for the next round. The 30 Years' War has 4 phases. Basically, the first phase is the Bohemian phase. This is where the war is fought at first. Then the Danes and the Swedes get involved, hence the name, the Danish and the Swedish phase. And then the final phase is the French phase. This is when France gets involved and starts throwing their weight around. But this is a war between Protestants and Catholics. And what happened is Frederick II, he's the emperor in the Holy Roman Empire, and he's the king of Bohemia. He's also Catholic. He starts to curtail the religious privileges in Bohemia of the Protestants. So basically, the Holy Roman Empire is Catholic, but a lot of places are Protestant, and they had been granted toleration, but now that's starting to be taken away. So there's this incident called the Defenestration of Prague. It happens in 1618. It's kind of like the spark that lights the war. Ferdinand II dissolves Protestant assemblies. He sends Catholic officials to Bohemia, and basically they start taking away toleration from Protestants, and they start doing a lot of things the Protestants don't like. So the Protestants start asking for an explanation. And what ends up happening is the Protestants take a couple of Catholic officials and throw them out the window. That's called the defenestration. It happens in Prague. The window was about 70 feet tall, so it probably should have killed them, but the men survive. What ends up happening is Catholics, when these men survive, these Catholics thrown out the window, when they survive, they spread the word that angels saved them from the hands of the evil Protestants. The Protestants write pamphlets and they say, no, the reason they were saved is there was a pile of trash and manure on the ground, and the Catholics landed in that filth, and that's what they survived on. But this is how the war starts. So the first phase, the Bohemian phase, Protestant versus Catholics in Bohemia. The major battle is the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. The Catholics win. So basically, the Catholics win in Bohemia, and the Protestants start losing their rights. So Ferdinand, since he's had these victories, he thinks I can start taking away Protestant rights and privileges in other parts of my empire. So that's what he does. When he starts traveling to other areas and conquering Protestants, the Danes get involved. Christian IV of Denmark, he's a Protestant. He sends an army to fight in Central Europe, but the Catholics keep winning. The Catholic general Albert von Wallenstein is kind of the imperial leader that's winning these victories for the Catholics. Something called the Edict of Restitution gets passed. Previously secularized church lands must be given back to the Catholic Church. So this angers a lot of Protestant princes. Later on, you have the Swedish phase. Gustavus Adolphus gets involved. He's kind of seen as one of the first great military geniuses in the early period of this European history. He saves the Protestant cause by his military tactics. He drives a lot of the Catholic army out of Germany. He, in a lot of ways, modernizes war. He used muskets and artillery very effectively. I got a quote here from a military book I have that basically describes what he does. It says, "A regiment such as this acts like an organism. It has one body, one movement, all ears hear the same command, eyes turn simultaneously, hands move as though they were one hand, alternating with musketeer and pike units. The musketeers, to cover themselves against the cavalry charge, move behind the pikes and reload their muskets, while reserve pike units would fill the gaps in the line left by them." So you have musket men that shoot at the enemy, but then as they're reloading, they step behind the guys with the spears who kind of take on the horses charging. So Adolphus knows how to modernize warfare and use the latest technology. The Spanish get involved because, remember, Spain is Catholic, so when the Holy Roman Emperor, who is Catholic, starts losing, the Spanish get involved. Because Spain joins, France also gets involved. I'll show you a map here in a second to kind of explain this. But the French under Cardinal Richelieu, he's kind of one of the most important French administrators. He supports the Protestant side. This war is not just religious, it's political. And let me show you the map. This will explain it. If you look at slide 41, okay, Spain and the Holy Roman Empire are Catholic, but France is in the middle of that. So if Spain and the Holy Roman Empire are successful, France will be in between two powers that are the Habsburgs. That was the royal family. So France doesn't want to have enemies on both sides. So France basically hopes that the Protestants will defeat the Holy Roman Empire, so that way that France won't be between two Habsburgs. So France chooses politics over religion. Eventually, Adolphus gets killed at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. The last phase of the war, the French phase, basically the French start paying for the war. They pay for the troops. They want to defeat the Spanish. So eventually, the French support the war. Ferdinand II dies, and his son wants to end the war. And you have the Peace of Westphalia. This is the treaty that ends the 30 Years' War. It's actually a series of treaties. This is kind of seen as the end of the religious wars in Europe. So 1648 is kind of the end of religious warfare in Europe. That doesn't mean religion won't play a role in things to come. It just means it's the last mainly war about religion. It recognizes some 30 German princes. It limits the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. It makes the Peace of Augsburg permanent. So northern Germany is permanently Protestant. Southern Germany is permanently Catholic. Germany remains divided and weak. Germany is not going to become a country until the 1800s. We'll talk about that much later. The Spanish Empire is in decline because of all these wars that Charles V and Philip II got involved in. It's 1648, basically the 1500s and the 1600s. Spain has been fighting wars all over Europe on behalf of Catholicism. They're drained now because of that. England is on the rise, but France really emerges as the dominant power. So the 1600s are going to kind of see France as the dominant power. And then later on in the 1700s, France and England will fight, and England will become dominant. And like I said, this is Europe's last war of religion. They decide to live and let live. Like I said, this was the most devastating war on Central Europe before World War I and II. 20% of Germany's population may have been killed. 8 million, they believe 8 million died. There's tons of plundering and atrocities committed against civilians. There's something called the Sack of Magdeburg. This was a Protestant city that was under siege by Catholic forces. A fire broke out in the city. 25,000 inhabitants were killed. One historian called this the Hiroshima of the 30 Years' War. So 30 Years' War is the last religious war. We're kind of done talking about Protestant Reformation, and now we'll move on to talking about other topics.